Writing a book's like dying. You get to hear people say nice things about you all the time.
Well, only if you write a nice book.
People create systems to make decisions for them. This is in many ways a natural thing to do and a necessary thing to do because the world is too complicated for individual managers to deal with everything on their own. When you delegate a decision to a system, either a literal computer algorithm or a policy, then you notice it has the attractive property that you're no longer accountable for that decision. Economists will always assume that everything is basically an optimization problem, because that's how they learned it. That is kind of the branch of the tree that they grew off. If you have an ideology, then you have a much quicker way of getting an answer to everything.
The joke is from Lord Acton, who said that rowing is the perfect preparation for public life because it always enables you to travel in one direction while you face in the other.
Members of this system might have the best motivation in the world, but the system they are working in is embedded within an overall structure that has its own agenda. Your company is quoted on the stock market, and the stock market has its own ideology, which is number go up. And the stock market's ideology is much more powerful than your vision statements.
You don't find out what you are until you have to trade off your honesty and your responsiveness.
A great boss back in the day who used to say, if it hasn't cost you any money, it's not a principle.
Welcome to another edition of Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. I'm here with an author of a really good new book, and I'm going to read you something I ran into about just a simple description. This is probably the first book I've read about the malaise of the last 16 years that has a satisfying analysis. Well, I agree with that. An awful lot of books kind of say what you're hearing everyone else say. And I'm here introducing Dan Davies, who's written a terrific book, which I recommend, called The Unaccountability Machine. And he, via the idea of unaccountability, which you will hear about, he helps us understand some things that have gone wrong and are going wrong. Now, Dan, that's your introduction.
Yeah.
You may want to add something, and if you after you add anything, I want to then ask for your elevator pitch. How do you explain your book with lots of different ideas, lots of moving parts in 1, 2, or 3 sentences?
No, I've not got anything really to add to that. It's great. Writing a book's like dying. You get to hear people say nice things about you all the time. I'm really liking it.
Well, only if you write a nice book. I've been looking at reviews today, and there's an awful lot of good reviews.
Yeah, I think my elevator pitch would be that people create systems to make decisions for them. This is in many ways a natural thing to do and a necessary thing to do because the world is too complicated for individual managers to deal with everything on their own. So they make systems to help them take decisions. But when you delegate a decision to a system, either a literal computer algorithm or a policy, then you notice it has the attractive property that you're no longer accountable for that decision. And that's why things start getting pathological, because people then begin to intentionally delegate their problems to systems in order to avoid accountability, and that can't help but end up badly. So, I mean, that's a bit of a long elevator ride, but that's really what the book is about and how these things might be managed better. And it's about a great 1970s weirdo management theorist called Stafford Beer, who seems to have got everywhere. He was David Bowie's favourite management scientist, if you can believe such a thing.
And his mate Brian Eno's.
Yeah, absolutely. And, kind of Eno regularly cites Stafford Beer's Brain of the Firm, a management textbook, as being one of the big influences on ambient music. So he got everywhere. And then the book's basically a description of how things went off the rails starting in about 1970, when everyone decided that the way they were going to deal with complexity was basically to ignore it and to assume that the free market would solve all the problems, because people, from Hayek onwards in the economics profession, have always regarded the market as being a magic all-purpose computer. I don't say it in the book, but I've said it on other occasions, that it's really weird that a profession that's based on the idea that there's no such thing as a free lunch is always so happy to help itself to an informational version of exactly the same that thing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, but that's sort of Hayek's message, isn't it? That this market will provide you. Yes, exactly. That the market is this giant information processing and decision making machine. Yeah. And as I mean, the way I put it is that, like Marx, like any self-respecting ideologist, he came up with a brilliant idea. Marx came up with a series of ideas, but he came up with a brilliant idea. It was highly diagnostic, and he thought it was also came with the cure. And we don't do that with cancer, do we?
Yeah.
If you come up with a really great paper on understanding cancer, we don't dust off our hands and say, well, that pretty much does it. Then we won't have to, we know how to cure cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, recording engineers always have this saying that if you can hear the problem, you can hear the solution. But that's because a recording engineer has a great big desk in front of them with knobs
which
that
somebody
change absolutely.
which got stuck together over decades for them to be in that situation.
Yeah, and which controls literally the entire information universe of the track that they're mixing. If we had a desk like that for the economy or for social problems, that would be just wonderful.
Yes, exactly. Listeners to this podcast might have already gathered, we're fairly simpatico in lots of ways about the ways in which we think the world has got things wrong. And yet you've gone about a completely different analysis of not exactly of what's wrong, but of ways into thinking about what's wrong and what to do about it. And I guess and I in another life, my one, have thought you used quite different arguments, less structured ones, and in a way more classical ones. So critical thinking, economists don't know anything about critical thinking. If you are dealing with a framework for making decisions, you need that framework. It's going to be a good idea if you weren't just given the framework and you don't just follow it. It's going to be a good idea if you appreciate that framework has its own limitations, that it got built, as Stephen Jobs said, by other human beings who were no smarter than, they're not, that they don't know everything. And so whatever you do, it really pays to be critically aware of what those things are that you're doing. Now that, I would argue, and we might talk about this a bit more, that's kind of fallen out of education almost. If you want to do that, you go off and do arts. But all these professional subjects are taught. You just get a blizzard of stuff to learn, a blizzard of techniques, and the thing, as Bach said, how do you play the organ? Well, you just move your fingers up and down here, and the thing more or less plays itself. That's roughly our approach.
Yeah, and I think that the way I kind of come to that, I had a really interesting conversation a couple of months ago with a guy in Berkeley called Ben Recht, who is
he's writing Substack articles about Paul Meehl, the philosophical psychologist, which I've been following, and he writes about Popper and people wow, there you go. I've been reading those books.
And he's an amazingly smart guy, and his day job is that he's in the engineering department, and
Yeah.
he's a works on statistical mechanics. He's basically, his day job is that he helps develop the mathematics behind recommendation engines. And what I was talking about with Ben is this concept he has of when maths becomes metaphor. Because you have in almost all kind of applications really good, strong mathematical results derived from basic principles of engineering or stochastic mechanics, which can describe perfectly a system that you have perfect information about. And you can do a hell of a lot with that. If you are Netflix, you've got access to the full information set of someone's choices. You've got access to your entire data set, and you can do a lot with that data. When you go out into the wild, or when you go out into the real world, firstly, you don't have access to the full information environment. Secondly, even if you did, it's vastly too big for any computer or any algorithm to handle it in reasonable time. So what you have at that point is really a kind of almost religious faith that the same mathematics does apply.
Yeah.
But you have to convert that mathematical understanding into like mathematical metaphors, into principles for how am I going to go about this. And at that point, your interaction with the world is very much going to depend, if you're coming from the quantitative social sciences, on the kind of maths you learned and the way that you learned them. And so economists will always assume that everything is basically an optimization problem, because that's how they learned it. That is kind of the branch of the tree that they grew off. And so, if you talk to and work with policy economists, I did this for a short period as a young man, they don't really write down equations. They print off charts and look at them, same as you and me. They calculate simple averages on any given day in any given economic policy organization. It's very rare that any maths above primary school level is used. It's long division.
Yeah.
At the back of their minds is a whole load of calculus and a whole load of kind of constrained optimization time series maths, but they're thinking about this metaphorically. And so in many ways, what you need to do with these people, as soon as anyone gets in a position where they might have power over someone else's life, is to make sure they have access to the full range of metaphors, which is partly what I've been doing in the book, because one of the great tragedies of our friend Hayek is that he was thinking in a very sophisticated way about information in the economy, but he was doing it in the 1920s and 30s. And the concept of information theory did not exist then. All of Hayek's key works on information in the economy were before Alan Turing. They were before Kurt Gödel, or they were kind of roughly coterminous with Kurt Gödel. They were before Wiener and Shannon. The concept of information was not on a sound kind of rigorous mathematic basis when he was doing these things. Unfortunately, all the economists who came after Hayek presumed that information in the economy was a solved problem. It was a done deal. It was the socialist calculation problem. Everything that was interesting to say about it, Hayek had said in 1928. And so they never really got to grips with the idea that information is a quantity, and as equally as important as balancing supply and demand is the ability to balance the information generated by the environment, the kind of chaos and variety and variability, of the world, with the capacity of the system that's meant to be regulating and managing that environment to process it. Because if your information balance sheet isn't balancing, then the system has become unregulated. And then not only is it going to go out of control, but also because it's unregulated, you cannot assume that your actions to try to control it are going to push it back to its steady state. It's quite often the case that you'll be pushing it out of equilibrium, and you'll be causing, what you'd recognize as oscillation if it happened in an engineering framework. because you're working on a broken model of reality. And, that's kind of my diagnosis of a lot of the state that we've got to, which is that we're just working on a broken or insufficient model of reality. And as a result, very often we're making policy interventions that are just pushing things further away from our desired state without us really knowing that we're doing that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to do a couple of things. I want to, push back in a way. I want to redescribe what you described was Hayek's achievement. And I will try to, might be a bit late. People might have tuned out by now. I'll try also to just say a bit more about who, Friedrich Hayek is the Austrian economist, who is fundamentally the mover and shaker, the first mover and shaker of 20th century neoliberalism. And he was in fact recruited by a guy called Lionel Robbins from the London School of Economics as a counterweight to Keynes. That's how he first came into contact with British economics, and he was he just knew that free markets were the answer, and he knew and just knew, and it turns out he was dead right, that socialist central planning was not the answer. Now, what I would say about what you've just said about Hayek and information is a little bit different, which is that I think what Hayek saw is just the beautiful coincidence of two things. One, he can start talking about information, and he can conceive of the economic problem as an information problem. And he's writing a lot about equilibrium at the time. And then the answer is right next to him, which is therefore the market. That the market does this in a beautiful way. As he puts it, it's more than a metaphor to describe it as a telecommunication system, a person without anyone knowing what the hell. If the crop fails in Brazil, if the wheat crop fails in Brazil, around the world, people will find themselves economizing on wheat, and particularly on the types of wheat that are grown in Brazil, without ever knowing anything about Brazil. This is a miraculous thing. So he brings these two things together, and this then gives me an opportunity to kind of surface a little concept of mine, which is the idea of the hack. So the idea of the hack is that it isn't just an understanding of a system which then enables you to define a problem, and then you go away and work on a solution. It is the bringing together of a problem and a solution. It is this seeing a connection across boundaries that are normally incredibly difficult to traverse. And he just locks onto this and says, therefore the market. And that's our friend Friedrich Hayek packaged up for the whole of the 20th century. Just like, I won't say Marx, but just like lots of Marxists are therefore the revolution. So this is my definition of the great vice of intellectuals, certain kind of intellectuals, ideological intellectuals, which is intellectual impatience. They want to get from the they want to get from the problem to the solution, and they're sure that everybody else is kind of wrong, and that they're wrong for reasons of either they're knaves or fools, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'll throw all those things at you and see what you think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, an ideology is in many ways a decision-making system.
Yes, absolutely.
The reason that intellectuals do this is it works. It's incredibly powerful. If you have an ideology, then you have a much quicker way of getting an answer to everything. Someone like yourself posed with a difficult problem, on all the kind of policy commissions you've been on, you have to sit down, read, talk to people, think about it for hours.
Mm.
Imagine how much quicker and easier your life would be, and how many more commissions you could serve on if you just said this needs a market solution.
Therefore, the market.
You might walk around the block in order to kind of fill out
Yeah,
the billable
yeah,
hours, but
yeah,
you've got a method for doing things.
yeah.
And all through kind of history, you can see that having a well-drilled ideological cadre is incredibly important to any
Which
political
Hayek
movement.
understood. Hayek understood that, and Hayek
Yeah,
talked about the second-hand
yeah,
peddlers of ideas. That's who he was
yeah.
actually trying to influence. Um,
Absolutely, and
yeah,
you have the Chicago boys in Chile who were literally an educated ideological cadre who had been sat down in a room by Hayek and
yeah,
educated for that purpose, for that mission. But even more broadly, you have everyone who became a fan of Milton Friedman.
yeah,
Everyone who went to business school and came out with what is regularly referred to in business press as the gospel of shareholder value. And I'm a big believer that you take metaphors seriously. Take jokes seriously and metaphors literally, and you will understand a huge amount about the world. And when you see people talking about the gospel of shareholder value, do not regard that as a metaphor. That is how those people saw themselves. And they went out and they did leveraged buyouts, and they didn't really understand how debt works and how debt works in the economy, because debt is not fundamentally a means of finance, it's a technology of control. And
yeah. Let's
as
get
a
on to that.
technology of
Yeah,
control,
yeah,
it
yeah,
has a lot of big problems.
yeah,
We can maybe talk about that later. But I think,
yeah, yeah,
the key here is that, as you say, the vice of intellectuals is like so many vices. It's a really powerful tool that people use because it works for them.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
problem, but it's not a problem for them.
I have to quote you something terrific I saw in a speech, or maybe a essay, which I think began as a speech by a Thomist, um, illegal philosopher, and he said, "Vice always comes disguised as virtue, no exceptions."
Oh
I
yeah,
love that,
yeah, yeah,
and that's. But I do want to say the other thing I wanted to say about ideology is that I think ideology, because of its efficiency, is absolutely the right way to begin to take in a situation. So you
mm,
kind of start to think, oh, well, that person's a left winger, that person's a right winger, and then you have to be able to update, and you
yeah,
have to be able to say, oh, that's interesting. I thought they were this
yeah,
because I had to think they were something. I had to start
mm,
putting together the picture, but I can see that they're not, if they're a left winger, they're not this kind of left winger, and they are interested in this, so that they do understand these things, and so on. And that's not very well rewarded in our
yeah.
intellectual ecosystem.
Oh yeah,
It's just, yeah, it's much
yeah,
better to just sort of hand out the credit cards and say I'm this kind of person. And the other thing about ideology is that it isn't just a theory. It's not just a theory of what is. It's a theory of why all those fools who
mm,
you don't agree with think that it's
yeah,
something else. And so it's a
yeah,
marvelous a marvelous kind of citadel of confirmation bias for the various different positions. It's
yeah,
why I just love what you said about paying serious attention to jokes
yeah,
I wrote this piece that you've read of mine,
mm,
called All Well That Ends Well. I stole
yeah,
the title from a comedian, in fact.
mm,
But I used this joke, which
mm,
I had used for decades. I learned it from Gough Whitlam. The joke is from Lord Acton, who said that rowing is the perfect preparation for public life because it always enables you to travel in one
mm,
direction while you face in the other. And I thought and I
mm,
used to use it as an
yeah,
embellishment. And then I basically put it up in the absolute center of a piece of writing that I did to try and explain how I it's not true that I'd
yeah,
wasted 10 years of my life, but how much promise there was and how little was realized. And I
mm,
was kind of unpacking all that. and and jokes. You can't write about jokes in academia, but jokes are about this double world that you get into because there's so much going on. Anyway,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and you know, comedians have to look at things from different angles because you know
yes,
that's what they do, and
yeah,
so you know it's you know comedians are very often very fallible people like ourselves, but it's
yes,
always worth listening to them because they're the people who develop the habit of mind of taking one step back and questioning kind of assumptions that the rest of us might just skate over. Stafford Beer, my guy, my kind of management theorist, was always making jokes in his books, which is one of the reasons
yeah,
I really love
yeah,
them.
yeah,
But there's one slogan of his that I think really spoke to me in terms of that article of yours, which I read, which is he always says the purpose of a system is what it does.
yeah,
Which means that often you look at some system or government department and say, well, if I was illiterate or didn't speak the language that all of these guys' slogans and documents are written in, what would I think this system is set up to do? You know, how can
yeah,
its purpose be the one thing that it consistently fails to achieve? In fact, the
yes,
people
yeah,
or the constituent members of this system might have the best motivation in the world, but the system they are working in is embedded within an overall structure that has its own agenda. The
yeah,
cumulative, impact of the purposes of the individuals is not just added together in order to create the system effects. Sometimes you have to look at a system and say, this prison is a system the purpose of which is to produce more hardened recidivist criminals. You know,
mm,
this kind of, as an example, use in my book, this animal hotel serves as a facility for feeding pet animals into industrial shredders. Which it was something that actually happened at Schiphol Airport due to extremely bad overlapping series of policies that no one monitored until the results became impossible to ignore. And
yes.
you can actually get that way without anyone really being to blame. And this is kind of why I call the book The Unaccountability Machine. It's not really always about dodging accountability on the part of individuals. It
No,
is just
no.
sometimes you can build an overall system in which the bad results come out of it, and they are genuinely not attributable to any one individual.
Yeah, and in my essay, I picked
Mm,
up, and I'll link to it in the show notes. The essay I wrote, you might
yeah,
recall, I picked up John Kenneth Galbraith's expression, innocent
yeah,
fraud, because I talked about evaluating a program, and I was the chairman of the organization that built the program, and the evaluation was a complete washout.
mm,
I mean, it was
mm,
hopeless. Everything went wrong. Nobody did what they should have done. Nobody was actually trying to get an answer. They
mm,
were all doing their jobs,
yeah,
which is a remarkable state of affairs because their job,
yeah,
the job of this, the job, the
yeah,
system, we had all intended to produce an evaluation
mm,
that was a worthwhile evaluation. Um, so it was a very nice illustration of the
yeah,
same sort of thing. So earlier, when you were talking about the purpose is of a thing is what it does, I guess my mind goes to, well, isn't it interesting that we now almost ubiquitously manage organizations with things like statements of purpose, mission statements, vision statements, and I've sort of gradually become more and more extreme in my view that this is a kind of anti-thinking. It's if intelligent and thoughtful people come up with a mission statement, fine, but
mm,
but mostly that kind of behaviour is a form of collective anti-thinking, and it's usually attended by people turning up at work on Monday morning and being surprised that everything's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. The mission statement is kind of, it's people trying. It's people noticing the power of a genuine ideology and a genuine kind of shared commitment, and thinking we can get us some of that in order to sell enterprise software. But the trouble is that, firstly, the purpose of a system is what it does is a slogan that works both two ways, because the philosophy of a system or organization is created in action. It's created by what it does, and it's created by the decisions that balance the here and now against the kind of future and elsewhere. The other big problem is that systems are always embedded in one another. So, as a company, you might say our purpose is better living through chemistry, or our purpose is to kind of enhance the lives of our customers while respecting diversity. But your company is quoted on the stock market, and the stock market has its own ideology, which is number go up. And the stock market's ideology is much more powerful than your vision statements. It's much more committed to it. It's a system, that's, it's like the Terminator. It's unthinking, it's unceasing, that it has one goal, and that's what it does. So in reality, what your company does is always going to be a compromise between your stated values and the values of the system in which you're embedded. And most of the time, the system in which you're embedded is a lot more powerful than anyone in that company. This is particularly the case when you have private equity getting involved, or the good people at Macquarie Bank getting involved.
So let's talk about that in a minute. Let me just stick on values for a second. I would go further and say that you put it beautifully when you said that. Well, you didn't put it in these terms, but you said the purpose is emergent from the situation and from practice. It's not something that you decide, and that, I would argue, is true of values. So the entire mental apparatus of an awful lot of organizations, when we do these things which sound commonsensical and are mostly inane, like where do we want to be in 5 years' time, and then we're going to, what is necessary to do that. Now, where you want to be in 5 years' time is agreed within the first half an hour in the morning. It's not, there's no careful thought. It's a nice aspirational statement, and it sort of goes, well, that means you don't know what you sort of junk in, junk out. But we all agree that we're honest and responsive, and we're this and we're that. And of course, you don't find out what you are until you have to trade off your honesty and your responsiveness, and so on. But none of this. So this apparatus, which again has often been introduced with the best will in the world, is a mechanism for putting you off track, actually stopping you understand what you're doing, the situation that you're in, and it further alienates you from solving your problems, it seems to me.
It's what the economists call cheap talk. I had a great boss back in the day who used to say, if it hasn't cost you any money, it's not a principle. And there's a lot of,
or as Nassim Taleb says, never trust an economist who's not rich.
But it was, you might say, we respect diversity and have zero tolerance for sexual harassment in the workplace. Then your top salesman, does something that you had previously viewed as unacceptable, and but then the company goes on still claiming that this is one of their principles and values when it's clearly not.
Yes. As displayed by behaviour as opposed to claims. So one of the things that just, it's kind of obvious, but reading your book Stafford Beer and management cybernetics is the term. It's about one way to look at it is that it's where does it choose to set up its tent? And it chooses to set up its tent that an organization is a series of governance layers. Yep. And I think we're in the world that's been encouraged by economics, in which governance goes on, but no one quite knows. No one decides, oh, this is a system that needs governance. Let's govern it. Rather, it just sort of emerges, and the market. The market is such a marvelous let out because you can say, well, we'll set something up. We don't know whether to make more, tanks than ships or hospitals. And so we'll have a market decide that. But of course, you haven't. You to do that, you have to make a whole bunch of decisions, and it's a kind of a get out of jail free card, which means that these systems don't get governed.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a whole load of areas where you would expect economics to have something to say, it just doesn't. It leaves the whole of strategy, the whole of marketing, almost the whole of management to the business schools. Which is, in my view, reading through management science literature is not the most rewarding experience of my life, I have to say. But what I would say is that every management science or management book that is worth the paper it's printed on is always dealing with one central problem, which is basically the only problem of management, which is stopping yourself from being overwhelmed with information. So trying to get a glass of water from a fire hose, literally making things manageable. And everything from Alfred Chandler's book, Structure and Strategy, dealing with DuPont and General Motors of the 1920s and 30s, through Stafford Beer, right up to, modern management classics. We used to call them airport books, but I guess in-flight Wi-Fi has pretty much done for that useful kind of descriptor. All of these books are about the fact that the world becomes complex. As you add things, the number of connections between them grows roughly, as the square of the number of things. Your capacity, as you add managers, your capability to manage grows in a roughly linear fashion. Over time, the gap between the number of connections between things that need to be managed and the capability of managing it becomes impossible. And at that point, the system reaches some kind of crisis, either a very obvious one with lots of fireworks like we had in 2008, or a more subtle general kind of meltdown of communication and management systems that might not be obvious to the outsider. And it has to reorganize.
Yes.
And systems
or a
reorganize
gradual
by delegating power downward. This is the only way that a system which is overloaded with information can bring itself back into rough, kind of balance between capability and variety. And it's a classic divide and conquer algorithm. If you've got a Rubik's cube that's got 47 quadrillion potential combinations, it's basically, very difficult to solve. If you treat it as 6 faces that pass colors to each other according to a small number of rules, then you can work out how to solve the Rubik's cube. On the other hand, if you just smash the thing and turn it into 27 tiny cubes, you can solve it, much more kind of, you can solve it instantly.
Right. And listeners will, I actually extracted that part of your book. There's a part of your book where you talk about the difference between a Rubik's cube, the problem of solving a Rubik's cube, and the problem of just arranging cubes in a particular order. And it's an excellent
Oh,
part of the book. It's a very nice
I'm
metaphor.
glad you liked that. My good friend Henry Farrell said it was the only part he hated. I
Why?
don't know. I think people think about things in different ways. That metaphor
Yeah,
just did not
yeah,
speak to him. It's sort of he kind of slugged through other bits. But to my mind, it's the metaphor delegation and organization. You split things down into smaller units; they are intrinsically easier
yeah.
to match, just because in terms of at smaller numbers, the difference between linear growth and exponential growth is less of a problem. The trouble comes because this involves letting go. This involves accepting that some parts of the system cannot be controlled literally from the top, which is, I guess, the big problem that you and I have been talking about all the time on this podcast. That desire of people to centrally organize things themselves, which cannot be done,
Mm.
and all of the pathological outcomes that you can get to as people try to solve a problem which is just fundamentally, almost physically, almost mathematically impossible for them to get the outcome that they want.
So, so yeah, you say letting go, and I'd say something a bit more. I'd say that it is about letting go, but I mean, one of the mysteries will do. It's not quite what I mean. It's not one of our dilemmas is that any mug can understand the benefits of bottom up management, but it turns out that it's actually pretty hard to do. There are a lot of people talking about it, but and I in 1983 I had my first serious job out of uni, which was as a staffer for our industry minister. Actually, I'd worked for him in opposition in 1981. That was when I was fresh out of uni. But in 1983, I went back and I encountered the Toyota production system. And I was just astonished. It's about as close to utopia as you can get in a dystopian world of car factories. And and it wasn't, you see, a lot of management, you've spoken about the best management literature. Unfortunately, there's a vast amount of bad management literature, and a lot of bad management literature will say it's about letting go, and I would say it's about it's about building the capabilities lower down before you let go. Your job is to try to empower this lower down system to do to do a lot better job itself.
Oh yeah,
Um,
no, absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
and that's hard. That's hard, and it's not done, as you say, by controlling it. It's done by nurturing it, by showing an interest in the fact that it has a perspective that that a person in a different situation can't have.
Absolutely. Toyota production system is a great example. I'm really glad you brought that up. It's, every Western non-Japanese company that picks up a book on lean production decides we're going to do some Toyota stuff ourselves. And they always, or they very, very often fail because they just look at it and go, we're going to put out a bunch of orders. We're going to have just-in-time manufacturing. We're going to build this supply chain.
Right.
And they never.
I've got to. Since you like jokes, I've got to tell you Edward Deming's joke, and he was an American statistical control mechanic and musician who helped Toyota design this system. And he said, the Americans they come with their notebooks, they take everything down, they go home, and they try to copy our system, but they don't know what to copy.
Yeah. And in particular, they never understand how much time and resources is spent in maintaining those relationships and building the communication channels that they're based on, because those are all made up of middle managers and just kind of slightly boring, slightly overweight guys sitting in offices making phone calls all the time. And if you are a hard-nosed, Anglosphere capitalist, you're going to look at that and say, this is overhead cost. We're going to become more efficient and cut this guy out. And it doesn't work. And one thing actually that coming back to Ben Rechts, who sort of also said this to me, the big difference in two very similar concepts of equilibrium and homeostasis. And the economists always think about things as being in equilibrium. Equilibrium is, by definition, a lowest energy state. It's what systems tend to automatically on their own and stay there. Homeostasis is a more kind of the management cybernetics guys are always talking about it. It's a medical kind of concept. Something that's homeostatic is staying in the same state, but homeostasis consumes energy to maintain that state. So your body temperature is, well, it's probably the best way to think about this. If your body temperature is in equilibrium, that's bad news, because it probably means that you're dead and that your body has now reached equilibrium with the surrounding ambient temperature. You want your body temperature to be in homeostasis, whereby there's a load of competing systems all aimed at managing that temperature to within, basically a degree centigrade either side of 37.5 degrees. And it's those systems which produce homeostasis which look like they're not producing a result, because they are producing the result of keeping the system in a consistent state. And the trouble is, resources like that always look like overhead. They always look, in most accounting systems, like a cost that you could cut and it wouldn't have any effect on output. And the thing is, cutting those costs doesn't have any effect on output for a while, in the
short term. Well, the other side of this, though, Dan, is that if you're the sort of senior manager that would cut all this, you're probably running middle management may well be pretty dysfunctional. In other words, middle management's really important. I mean, this is the Toyota story that they had one of their slogans is to drive out waste, but of course their definition of waste isn't just physical waste; it's wasting people's time. Wasting middle managers' time, wasting people, wasting the time of the people on the assembly line, all these kinds of ideas. So that's why this stuff is so hard. It's easy to critique getting rid of middle management. Anyway, they're trying to copy Toyota and they don't know what to copy.
Absolutely. Kind of dealing with the system, diagnosing the system has to come from an understanding of what these things are for. And as you say,
it preferably comes from within the system. This is my point about criticism. And so this became very evident to me during COVID, when it was just so clear that we had tried, that our medical infrastructure was that the metaphor, the fundamental unit of behavior coming out of this was we had trained our doctors, our medical system, as bureaucrats. And what I mean by that is that we'd said to them things like, they get taught things like a randomized controlled trial is the gold standard of evidence. Pig's ass, it's the gold standard of evidence. It's not the gold standard of evidence that parachutes work. There's a lot more context to be gone into than that.
Once more, take metaphor seriously. The gold standard was a terrible monetary system.
Right. Well, that's another way to do it. Yeah. Well, that's another critique of it. I mean, another extraordinary example to me just blows my mind that COVID arrived. Every government in the world had a pandemic action plan, a run book, a plan, which is a good thing. And they were all built on the idea that this was an influenza. We were pretty sure pretty quickly that it wasn't an influenza. And it took, now I might be wrong because maybe it happened in some other country, but at least from my listening to an excellent program in Australia called The Health Report, it was the New Zealand medical establishment in, I don't know, April, May of 2020. When's COVID arrived? 2020, I think. And so this thing's been around for 5 months. We've known it's not an influenza for 3 of these months, and no one has said, "Oh, right, well, we need to think about our plan."
Yeah.
Go figure. Just extraordinary. I participated in some policy making in 1991, where I was in the Treasurer's office, and the government announced, and it was a heretical thing to say, that it was going to have a fiscal stimulus because we were in a deep depression or a deep recession. And what happened was that the central agencies, which had all the power and all the prestige, simply went into a budget round. And what happened was they said to the line departments, "You come up with ideas to spend more money and we'll try and knock them down." And so they proceeded to do this. And then they knocked them all down. And then like, we got panic calls the Sunday before the Tuesday when this thing was released, saying, "Oh, we've now got a stimulus that's 0.25% of GDP, and it's too small." There wasn't a document saying how big should we make this. Anyway, so these are, kind of governance on autopilot. This kind of stuff just goes on constantly. Firstly, if you want to respond to that, please do, and then I wanted to get on to decerebration, which I think is a marvelous concept and word.
You go on. I have nothing to say with that, but it's just because I agree with it so much.
Yes. Or as Stuart Lee says, I agreed the fuck out of it. He says in one. He said, "Well, he's talking about the audience. He's, it was great. I mean, it wasn't funny, but I agreed the fuck out of it." Anyway, so I've one of the things I've thought about a lot, and by thought about a lot, I mean, well, pondered. Just sort of had it in my mind a long time, is something which is known in the political science literature as the hollowing out of systems, the hollowing out of political parties, which used to be about 2 or 3% of the community and is now a kind of managerial rump of brand managers who are managing the brands of the Labor Party and the Conservative Party in your country and Liberal Party and Labor Party here. And that is a process, and in the process of trying to get votes, trying to chase what's necessary to get votes, which is to get the right stories on telly and so on, a kind of madness has overcome the system. It's you began this discussion by talking about a system that has kind of one dimension to it and goes crazy, like a paperclip making machine. And what your book does is, I regard this process as kind of mysterious in politics. It's I don't understand how it was the way it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and is the way it is now. I don't. I mean, I can tell a story. We can all tell a story, and you just say, well, these are the things that happened. But how did this earlier regime, which seems so much healthier, become this later crazed regime? And your book, at least in the area of commerce, shows how various financial mechanisms drive out the stuffing and hollow the system out by force. So I wanted to invite you to talk about that, and you might even begin by telling us about the decerebration of the cat.
This is it's one of the kind of slightly alarming stories that Stafford Beer used to drop into lectures to wake people up. It's kind of 50 minutes into a podcast, it's probably a good time to put it in, which is that the animal victims of horrible early neurological experiments included a case where you take a cat and sever the connection between its cerebellum and the rest of its brain, and there you have a decerebrate cat. And the decerebrate cat is a strange animal because it can eat, it can groom itself, it can function,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
is no longer.
So the lower down
Yeah,
systems
yeah.
continue to work.
It can.
Yeah.
It is just no longer capable of purposive action. The decerebrate cat will continue to
Yeah.
live as long as food is brought to it and as long as it is kept warm and kind of kept in the same environment. If a new stimulus comes, or if it's put in an environment where it has to make decisions and do something, the decerebrate cat will not function and will not die. And Stafford Beer,
It will
yeah,
die.
it
And
will
will
die.
die.
Sorry, yeah,
And
yeah.
will die. Yeah.
Stafford said
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the decerebrate organization was, even in the
Yeah.
1970s, becoming much more of a thing. They were still able
Yeah.
to continue their operations, but they'd lost the
Yeah.
capability to form plans and to kind of have purposive actions. In the corporate world, to my mind, it's quite clear what was happening. And what was happening was basically debt. Because the way that I'd put this is that an indebted company has to have as one of its priorities the servicing of the debt. Whatever else it wants to
Yeah.
do, that's a survival condition. It has to be able to make the payments. A very indebted company can have no priorities other than making the next debt payment. It becomes,
Yeah.
and this is what I think all of these things in the abstract, wherever you see them, if you've got a decerebrate organization, what you've got is something where one particular source of problems has become a signal that drowns out absolutely everything else. So, over in our
Yeah.
country,
Yeah.
Thames Water might have wanted to invest in sewage capacity and not to be kind of pumping, untreated human excrement into most of the rivers in England. But
Yeah.
that's one of their long-term objectives and goals. It's probably on their vision
That's
statements,
a luxury.
we're not
A
going to
luxury.
pump, human
Yeah.
excrement into the rivers. Their immediate
Yeah.
survival condition was that they had to make the
Yeah.
payments on all of the debt that their private equity owners had
Yeah.
made them take
Yeah.
on. And so
Yeah.
that became their only priority. They became basically a rent extraction machine for which the production of clean water was, one of the operations that just simply did whatever was in front of it. And when something happened like an unusual rainstorm, it was unable to react to that. And this kind of thing spread throughout the economy. One of the things we do know about the last 50 years is that corporate indebtedness has gone through the roof. Leveraged buyouts
Yeah.
have been used effectively as a system of discipline by the capital owners on the management of companies. Something like that seems to have happened in the political system. It's obviously not the same story because government debt doesn't work in quite the same way as corporate debt. You can't really shut a country down and replace its government, not in the developed world anyway. But you also have, I think, this accelerated media cycle in which
Mm.
daily news headlines and increased frequency of polling and all of these kind of short-term signals just seem to have become that kind of screeching siren in head office that makes it impossible to listen to anything else that you might be doing.
Mm. Yeah. No, it's very interesting. Debt in this sense is the ultimate top-down
Yeah,
mechanism. It represents so these are obligations on the organization imposed from above, and they're completely cacophonous. They're completely
yeah,
consuming, all
yeah,
consuming.
yeah,
And so all it has to, and then you're in this position of
yeah,
worship of the
yeah.
debt
It's
obligation, the
it's a
servicing of
one-way
the debt
communication
obligation.
channel. Yeah,
And equity is completely
yeah,
and equity is completely
yeah,
different because is equity is this relationship between
yeah.
the source of capital and the people who are dealing with the money. This sounds like an argument for Islamic finance to me. I don't know
Uh,
whether you've
I
given that any thought, but that this is
Yeah.
They tell us in the good book, in lots of good books, that
Yeah.
debt is the devil's instrument.
It is the argument for the prohibition of debt of interest-paying debt under Islam. It's quite explicit
Yeah.
in. I've read, I think, half of one textbook on Islamic finance when I thought I might need to know something about it for a job, and then didn't. But all of the
Yeah.
theology here is very much about the nature of the debt relationship, and exactly what you say. It's a one-way communication channel. There's no kind of negotiation. There's just, here's a demand for an amount of cash on a given date. Either you can pay it or you can't.
Yeah. I thought my understanding of the taboo on debt was that it was a kind of, it's often expressed in a
Yeah.
way that would also be a taboo on equity, which is that you are lending out or providing money
Yeah.
and then you expect more money in return. And the idea is that money itself
Yeah.
can't have that.
Yeah.
That's a blasphemous
Yeah. Yeah.
or idolatrous relationship, which is different to the control
Yeah.
argument that you're
Well,
using.
but the thing which makes an Islamic debt-like contract halal, so to speak, is whether you are sharing
Uh-huh.
in the risks of the venture. So, the
Yeah.
way in which,
Yeah.
because you do
Yeah.
have Islamic bonds, and they're always structured in such a way as to give the notional creditor at least some, in principle, kind of sharing of the enterprise of that they're lending money,
Yeah.
that they are lending money to.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
thing that really
Yeah.
makes something haram in Islamic finance is getting your kind of return without having that kind of relationship to the operations and that relationship to the business that you're in. And it's in textbooks as Islamic finance these days. This was Christian finance well into the Middle Ages.
That's my wonder whether what I get is from the Christian stuff, and I'm thinking that it's not entirely clear that it is distinguishing
Mm.
between debt and equity, because it's got this idea that there's something wrong about using money to make money.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you might be right. I think obviously what a lot of what's happened is that over the years, Islamic finance, wants to use debt. Debt is actually really convenient
Yeah, of
for
course.
investors,
Well, of course.
and so
Yeah,
it's come
yeah,
up with these kind of theological wranglings in order to get something
yeah,
that
yeah,
lets you
yeah,
do debt
yeah,
without being so
yeah,
blatantly in defiance of the Quran, whereas the Christian finance approach
yeah.
was to just kind of forget it and go, yeah, no, all that stuff we said
That's
about
right.
usury
That's right.
was
That's right.
we've decided we didn't
That's
mean
right.
it, and so just to literally ignore it. So I think
Yeah.
the
Well,
difference
see,
there,
this.
therefore, is about 1,000 years worth of lawyering.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Um, this, yeah. Look, I'll mention one other thing because it sort of ties in, and that is this thing that you just decide to ignore
Yeah.
something. and one of the things I thought about when reading your book is, we've got different ways of explaining the same phenomenon, which is that economics just decides to ignore stuff that it doesn't know what to do with. And the great
Mm.
impasse, you can sort of show this as an episode in which the discipline
Mm.
itself kind of acknowledged this and then just moved on. And this was the theory of the second
Yep.
best. Now, the theory of the second best, produced by Lipsey and Lancaster, one of them was
Yep.
an Australian, Lancaster, I think, in 1956, I think it was. And they basically, a pretty reasonable interpretation of the theory of the second best. Well, let me just tell you the result, which is that people are familiar with economists saying you've got to remove distortions, and a typical distortion would be to cut tariffs from 50% to zero. You're getting rid of these distortions. And the theory of the second best tells you that if there are any remaining distortions, you can no longer have any confidence that getting rid of a particular distortion will make things better. It's just as likely to make things worse. Now, in fact, it was written as such by a guy called Mission. I think he was Hungarian, in a paper, really good paper in 1960, in which he said, look, this is an impossibility theorem. This is telling us that this method that we've spent the previous century, the whole century working up, isn't any use to us in figuring out practical problems. And there's quite a fertile period of time when, and he sort of tries to carve out some of the principles you might be able to extract, so where you can use what then started to be called first best thinking and stuff like that. But that just that sort of just disappears into the footnotes, and everything the caravan moves on.
It was inconvenient to the ideology, so it got left behind.
Well, I would say it was yes, but I think another way of saying it is that it was inconvenient to producing to producing articles of a particular kind. So you just we've got to eat.
So it's always I call it CAMO, CAMO, cite and move on. That's
yes, CAMO. That's good. Well, we've spoken about jokes a few times here, and I've written an essay on the joke that is at the end of Annie Hall, where Woody Allen tells this story in which Woody Allen's character tells this story in which a man goes to the psychiatrist and he says, "I'm not here for myself. I'm here for my brother I've got a real problem. I want you to help me with him." He says, "What's the problem?" He says, he thinks he's a chicken. And the psychiatrist says, "Well, why don't you turn him in?" And he says, "Because we need the eggs." So why wasn't the proper regard had for the theory of the second best? Because people needed the eggs.
Well, I'm not going to top a Woody Allen joke. So
okay, good. Well, terrific to speak, and thanks very much for doing this.